From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. If you listen to Pollination, you know that I love fruit, love Oregon fruit. They're some of the best fruit that's grown anywhere on the planet. And right at the top, just beside the Hermiston melon, are sweet cherries grown in the Columbia River Gorge. And we heard on a previous episode, there's a lot going on with sweet cherry production and fruit production in the Columbia River Gorge. We heard Mace Vaughn talking about some great NRCS initiatives to create pollinator habitat around those orchards. But I wanted to learn a little bit more about the pollination of this crop. Admittedly, it's a crop that I'm just starting to get to know. And I thought, what better way to do this to reach for an external perspective? And I found just the person. Dr. Maxime Eeraerts is a postdoctoral researcher at WSU working with Dr. Lisa de Vetter, who I'm going to have on an episode talking about blueberry pollination shortly. We're going to talk today about some work that he did at Ghent University in Belgium, working with sweet cherry pollination. And in this episode, it's great because we talk about sweet cherry pollination, but there's this really great segment that you don't want to miss after the break, where he talks about using mason bees in cherry pollination. He has some excellent recommendations for those of you who are mason bee producers on how to reduce parasites in your blocks. So stay tuned. This week, we're going to dive into cherries with Dr. Maxime Eeraerts on pollination. Okay, well, all the way in Belgium, welcome to Pollination, Dr. Eeraerts.
Hello, welcome, Anthony. Thanks, Anthony, for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you here today. Sweet cherry is our topic, and sweet cherry is grown everywhere. It's grown here in the Pacific Northwest. It's grown there in Belgium. It's grown everywhere, I think all the way to Asia, Japan, and South Korea being huge sweet cherry producers. And it opens the question of what are the pollination needs for sweet cherry? Is it self-compatible? Do you need to plant another cultivar to be able to get fruit? Do you need to transfer pollen by an insect? Tell us about the pollination needs of sweet cherry.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also amazing. Every year I find new countries that have commercial cherry production, like also in Scandinavia and Morocco. It's
a cosmopolitan crop.
It's a cosmopolitan crop. You could say it like that. Yeah. And concerning the pollination needs, it's not pollinated by wind. To start with, so it needs insects to mediate the transfer of pollen and to facilitate pollination, and therefore also the fruit set and the yield of the crop. And the compatibility of different cultivars actually is quite variable. You have a lot of self-compatible cultivars. So those are cultivars that you can plant in a monoculture block with only that cultivar because they don't need pollen from other cultivars in order to be pollinated and to set fruit. But when it comes to European sweet cherry, most commercial interesting sweet cherry cultivars are self-incompatible. So this means that they need another cultivar, so another genetic sweet cherry source of pollen in order to set fruit or to be pollinated. So the bees, they need to transfer pollen of another cultivar to the anthers of the commercial, to the stigma of the commercial cultivar in order to set fruit.
All right. So that means when you're planting your orchard, you're going to need to put trees in there that may not necessarily be the target crop tree, but I guess you just need their pollen.
Yeah, and for every commercial cultivar, there are multiple pollinizer cultivars, which they are called pollinizer cultivars, available. And then, depending on the grower, they are planted in full rows next to multiple full rows of the commercial cultivar, or they are planted in between the rows. So every 4th or 5th tree would be a pollinizer cultivar.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'd always known, especially for cultivars that have incompatibility problems, that growers would deploy a pollinator tree every 3 to 5 trees, for example. But it hadn't dawned on me that this crop has grown so widely that there's probably a lot of different practices. There's not a one size fits all approach to pollinizer deployment. But this leads me into the next question. So growers are clearly conscious of their pollination needs because they're physically laying it out in their orchards. But I want to turn the question towards what growers' thoughts are on the insects that actually move the pollen. In Belgium, it seems like there's a wider array of bees that are used, managed bees that are used for pollination. And I just want to see, paint that picture for us a little bit about the different bees that are used in Belgium and growers' consciousness of their contribution to fruit set and yield.
Yeah, so all growers in Belgium with whom I worked with, and also more or less all growers in Europe that have sweet cherry, they apply honeybees in their orchards during bloom. But there's a very great variability regarding the stocking density. So some growers only put 1 hive per hectare. Some even go up to 10. And also regarding price of the honeybees, there's the diversity is very big. Some growers get their honeybees for free, for instance, while some have to pay €100 per hive.
Really?
So that's interesting to note. And then concerning other bees like bumblebees and mason bees, which you can also manage or rent or buy to pollinate. The bumblebees like Bombus terrestris, the commercial species that is reared and sold by BioBest and Koppert. It's clear that the last 5 or 6 years that implementation of commercial bumblebees in sweet cherry has increased.
Really?
Yes, this I think at this moment in time, 20% of the fields of the cherry orchards are stocked with bumblebees. Of course, this is very expensive. And regarding the mason bees, implementation is more limited, but there's a great interest concerning those mason bees. The main implementation bottleneck, of course, is how do you effectively manage these bees? Where do you acquire them? You can also rent them or buy them, but then it's again very expensive. And then you also have, of course, the native pollinators, the native bumblebee queens, and definitely an important group are the ground nesting solitary bees. They are very much underestimated or go unnoticed by growers. These, of course, are species which are it's more difficult to identify a ground nesting solitary bee or distinguish a ground nesting solitary bee from a honeybee than distinguish a bumblebee queen or a bumblebee worker, for instance, or a mason bee. Mm-hmm. But these ground nesting solitary bees, like mining bees, for instance, they can be very abundant in cherry orchards, and they have similar characteristics to mason bees. They are very, very efficient to pollinate sweet cherry and other tree fruit crops. They also forage close to their nests. Depending on the species, they also forage when weather is suboptimal. And they really contribute significantly to the sweet cherry pollination and sweet cherry yield if they are present in the orchard.
Now, you've done some surveys of Belgian growers, and do they have a sense of this varying efficacy? Because I know it must be hard to sort of make the case for other bees when honeybees are so abundant. You see them on every flower, and you may have another species that's very efficient, but the growers may not see them. They may be working up high. They may be very fast. Do you have a sense of their consciousness of this kind of biological, asymmetry between honeybees and other species in terms of their abundance and efficacy.
Yeah, it first of all, it depends on from grower to grower. And second, I think the awareness has definitely been increasing the last couple of years in Belgium. That might also be because I did a lot of research in cherry and we communicated our results at during study days and via grower articles. But you definitely still see that they underestimate the ground nesting bees, for instance. It's also very difficult to see them compared to bumblebees.
That's really interesting. I think that's the education piece of just, familiarizing growers with some basic bee biology and where these bees live can pay these dividends. That's an excellent example from Belgium. And I guess I want to transition now just to thinking about where those bees are going. Clearly, many of the bees are visiting the cherry trees. It's a very open flower. Many generalist bees will visit and reap the rewards, the abundant nectar and pollen that comes off of cherries. But I know you've also done research looking at how these different bees will use the landscape and, not only surrounding landscape. I can imagine both agri-environmental schemes like hedgerows, but also wildland. But in addition to the plants that are growing in the orchard themselves, the orchard floor can often have an abundance of different flower species like dandelion and daisies and clover. So tell us a little bit about what you found in terms of how these different bees use this landscape, and what growers need to know about that.
Yeah. It's for this, to answer this question, it's important to note that for both solitary bees, bumblebees, and honeybees, the lifespan of the life cycle in a year spans longer than the blooming period of sweet cherry or another crop. Even if you take into account the different flowering periods of sequentially flowering cultivars of the same crop, the lifespan definitely starts earlier and ends later than those flowering periods. So it's important to have floral resources before and after flowering, the flowering periods of the crop. So that was a bit the initial thinking, and that spurred this study to go and look into the landscapes and also into the orchards. What can we find, or what can bees find that is of interest before and after sweet cherry flowering. And here we found very interesting results. It's also very obvious, of course, that native vegetation like hedgerows, tree rows, forests, shrub vegetation, that they provide a lot of floral resources from the start until the end of the season, which are used both by honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, mason bees, but also hoverflies. So you find those sweet cherry pollinators in those habitat elements, foraging on a lot of trees, shrubs, and also herbs. And then in addition to those landscape elements, we also saw that the herbaceous vegetation or the grass strips in the alleyways of the orchards, that they also provide a lot of interesting plants or attractive plants, like dandelion, buttercup, white clover, and that we also saw that a lot of the key pollinators for sweet cherry and obviously also for apple and other crops, that they use or forage on those flowers. So in this way, you can also conclude that the vegetation in the alleyways can provide a valuable floral resource before and after, and also during flowering of the crop. And based on these data sets, we can then propose plant species that are highly attractive for bees and that flower before or after the crop, like willows or hawthorns. We can propose or advise those plants to be incorporated into hedges or hedgerows or similar plantings that growers or other stakeholders are planning. And these benefit bees in general, but also they benefit key pollinators of crops like sweet cherry.
I know that we'll come around to this in a minute. You're working currently in blueberries in the Pacific Northwest, but I imagine that bloom on the shoulders of the bloom of the crop is very good. It would bring pollinators into the system. They nest. Mm-hmm. They would then pollinate the crop, and then afterwards, as you explained, for something like a social bee, like a bumblebee or a bee that hasn't quite finished its reproduction, having bloom after the crop will allow it to maximize its reproduction, and presumably over time there'll be more pollinators in that landscape. But what about the bloom that occurs coincidental with the cherry? Is there any evidence that from your work that the bees would be drawn away from pollinating the cherry?
We also looked at that, and we actually found a positive effect. Orchards with more flowering dandelions or buttercups or daisies during the sweet cherry bloom had more native pollinators, wild pollinators like bumblebees and solitary bees on the sweet cherry blossom. And we clearly saw a gradient of orchards without those flowering herbs and orchards with a lot of those flowering herbs, and that gradient was not correlated with the gradient of native vegetation in the landscape. So it's an additive effect above the landscape. And these findings have also these results or conclusions have also been detected in a sweet cherry study in Germany. I also saw some data of sweet cherry in Australia that found that those co-flowering herbaceous plant species have a facilitating effect on diversity and abundance of bees on the crop. And so the effect on yield has not been shown yet, but you would assume that there definitely won't be a negative effect or a competition effect based on the studies that in cherry, and also based on the studies. There are a couple in apple, a couple in some annual crops that found similar results. Some studies that study these aspects found no effect, but there are no studies, to my knowledge, that detect a negative effect.
I was thinking a very similar thing has been found in a related species. It's a big pollination crop here in the United States and also in places like Turkey and Spain is almonds. That there appears to be you can plant brassicas alongside the crop, and it doesn't seem to take the bees away. In fact, in some cases, there appears to be the positive effect.
Yeah, definitely. I think almonds. I've never seen almond orchards in the US, but if you see the pictures and the documentaries, they're almost most of the time are completely. The herbaceous vegetation is completely removed. So, bees most of the time require multiple resources or benefit from multiple resources. So it would seem logical that those studies in almonds would find a similar result.
Well, fantastic. Let's take a quick break. I want to come back and ask you about the orchard bees. There's a lot of interest in the Pacific Northwest on orchard bees, and you have experience with them in Belgium, different species, but some neat management principles. So let's take a break, and I want to ask you some questions about osmia. Okay, there is a lot of interest in the Pacific Northwest about using blue orchard bees. Many people are using them in their backyards, but there have been studies. USDA is leading them in sweet cherries, and there's a close relative to this. You were working with a close relative to the species we use here, Osmia lignaria, the species that I understand that you studied or is being used in sweet cherry in Europe is Osmia cornuta. Can you tell us about your discovery about how to improve Osmia cornuta's health, specifically around looking at nesting material? I think there's some lessons here to be learned for the Pacific Northwest. So walk us through that work.
Yeah. There are definitely, the study is very interesting. And we studied multiple questions and multiple topics about both rearing methods and the health or the vitality of the offspring of mason bees. Mason bees, of course, are a very good pollinator for all 3 food crops. So it's definitely also relevant for your region. And the main question that we asked were, what's the influence of different types of nesting material? Because there are a lot of nesting materials that are out there that are suitable for rearing and implementing mason bees, like wooden groove boards, bamboo, paper straws, cardboard tubes, styrofoam, even styrofoam, I think, and so
I've seen I've got a shelf in my office with all of these materials. Everybody's tried everything. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. and everyone is convinced that this is the best material, and another one is convinced that that's the best material. And I think every material works and every material will have its benefits. But then we also looked at the timing of parasite infestation. And we also looked at the influence of landscape structure on parasite infestation and vitality of the offspring. And a first important finding of this study is that I recompared cardboard tubes with wooden groove boards. So the wooden groove boards you stack, and then you get a block of wooden groove boards that you can open and you can clean them out. And this is assumed to be necessary to clean the cocoons and the nests in order to reduce parasites or to control parasites. So first important finding is when comparing cardboard tubes and wooden groove boards was that the cardboard tubes clearly have a lower reduction of mite infestation, which is very interesting because cleaning out the wooden groove boards, it's a lot of work and it's not bulletproof, and you have to then wash the cocoons, etc. But you clearly reduce the mite infestation a lot. Like 80% of the mite infestation is reduced.
I suppose when I think about it, those tubes, the mites, I imagine the bees bring them in, but once a cell, these pollen mites invade a cell, they could find a crack and just crawl to an adjacent cell. Is that the thinking with these wooden blocks, that there's all these cracks that the mites can disperse through?
Yeah, that's correct. The mites, they are very, very, very tiny, and when they find a little crack or a little hole, they can easily just go from brood cell to brood cell and then start consuming pollen. And in the cardboard tubes, that's probably the mechanism whereby they are stuck. If the bees bring them in, they're in a certain cell, and the bees, they make a very, very good construction in between cells out of mud. So they make a wall out of mud in between each brood cell. and these they probably, because the bees also naturally nests in round cavities, the bees probably are more accustomed to filling and completing a wall in a round cavity and making it really sealed or concealed, compared to the wooden groove boards where you always have these tiny cracks and corners. So yeah, the nesting material clearly has an influence on parasite infestation, mainly reducing the mites, which is in our region, that's I think number one parasites in Osmia. Definitely when you consider the abundance in the brood cells.
It would be the same here, same in here in Oregon. I think pollen mites are the number one problem that many people deal with.
Yeah, so that's an interesting finding. And the second part of the study, where we looked at when are brood cells infested, and we took samples in the beginning. Right before cherry bloom, 2 times during cherry bloom, 1 time after cherry bloom, and then we clearly saw that you have these fruit flies which also eat the pollen, and you also have other parasites like wasps and flies that eat the brood, so the larvae of the bees. And we found that that the parasite infestation of those fruit flies increased with time. So the infestation of the fruit flies clearly is a lot higher after bloom.
I see where this is going. This is
also very interesting, that if you would close the nests, for instance, in sweet cherry cultivation after sweet cherry bloom, that you would reduce infestation of those fruit flies in your mason bee rearing.
So let me get this straight. So it sounds like what happens is that as time goes on, the parasite populations get larger and larger, and the opportunity for then they find the nests. So if for some way you were able to pull them out of cherries early, or just after petal bloom, you would reduce the level of parasitism. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the same goes for the proportion of females. The proportion of females in the brood cells. So in each brood cell, you have one cocoon, one larva that spins a cocoon and it becomes an adult bee. And the proportion of females also clearly is reduced at the end of bloom. So by taking out the nests or closing the entrances of the nests after bloom, you would decrease the fruit fly infestation, and you would also have a sufficient number of female offspring, because most of those female offspring have been produced by that time.
I see. So the idea here would be that if you left them in the orchard to keep reproducing, so clearly the osmia could go a little bit longer, but if you left them in the orchard for a little bit longer, not only would they not produce very many more females because they've switched their, as people know, the last couple cells in the tube are males. They would just produce males, which don't conduct the pollination, and so the producer of the bees wouldn't see a huge benefit from leaving them later, but the cost would be that they would get high levels of predation and what a great finding. So leading to a recommendation, I imagine, once the petals have dropped, to bring those to close those boxes up.
Yeah, that's my thinking as well. And if you do that with cardboard tubes or bamboo or something similar with a round cavity, you probably reduce infestation of your mites, infestation of your fruit flies. We did not see an effect of the wasps or other parasites because the numbers were too low. That's an important issue for future research, of course. It was a bit surprising. Normally, you would have more parasites than just the fruit flies. Closing the nest also you have sufficient female offspring by that time anyway. And another finding was when we looked at the landscape, we mapped the amount of native vegetation, and we saw that with decreasing proportion of natural habitat like hedgerows and forest edges and shrubland, that you get also an increasing proportion of females in the brood cells. So that's an extra recommendation to provide some, based on one of the previous questions, like the willows and the hawthorns, which are very attractive and beneficial for pollinators and also for mason bees, that if you provide those resources close by the orchards, in a hedgerow or in a solitary tree or solitary shrub, that these plants also improve the ratio of females in your nesting boxes.
You know, that reminds me of an episode we had with Lila Westreich from the University of Washington, a graduate student there, who we do need to catch up with. But she pointed out that if you look at the pollen provisions for a lot of Osmia lignaria in Western Washington, there was a lot of willow, not a rosacea plant. Everybody thinks, oh, plums, cherries, apples. These bees are generalists, and they go to a lot of different plants. And the other thing that occurs to me is that using mason bees in these orchards can be a good metric for how other solitary bees are doing, because, you know, if they have high reproductive success, that probably translates to other solitary bees that have, you know, similar phenology to the mason bees. Seems like an excellent tool for asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's also very important to note that this is, I think the results that we found in this study are very specific for Osmia cornuta and sweet cherry in Belgium or Europe.
Yeah.
And for another species like Osmia lignaria or in Washington or Oregon, I think it would be very interesting to see if those patterns, if the patterns that emerge are similar. And also, it would be also interesting to see if these patterns are that they show, that they keep on showing year after year, if you follow up these populations, let's say 4 or 5 years, for instance.
Well, I think that's a great prompt and a reminder to me to reach out to Dr. Lindsay McCabe at the USDA lab in Logan, Utah. We need to have her on the show because I know she's been doing trials on sweet cherry in the Pacific Northwest, and it's a great opportunity to catch up with her. But before I want to just quickly transition off. We're going to have Dr. Lisa de Vetter on the show to talk about a new USDA project to develop a pollination planner for blueberry growers. I know that you're working on this right now. You've transitioned off sweet cherries and you're starting to work on blueberries, and you're probably starting to crunch data. Can you just tell us briefly about this project and sort of your role in it?
Yeah, so the project has multiple work packages, of course, and the first work package is the one I'm involved in the most. And here the major questions are more or less honeybee related, and we will investigate what the influence is of hive stocking density per field on both honeybee visitation and also blueberry yield. In addition, we will also study the influence of hive placement of honeybees on both honeybee visitation and blueberry yield. So with hive placement, we mean that the honeybee hives are either placed along the rows, that they're either dispersed along the rows of the blueberries, or that the hives are clumped in big drop zones in the corner or next to the field. So, and we will also study the influence of this hive placement, so dispersed or clumped, on pesticide exposure for the honeybees. So these are the main questions of the first year, which are studied in 4 states: Oregon, Washington, Florida, and Michigan. And my role mainly is to coordinate and execute the field work and collect the data for Washington in 2021, and also to analyze the data of the first year of the 4 different states of this work package.
I imagine you have your computer is full of data.
yeah, it's a lot.
It sounds like a huge and exciting project. So I look forward to talking with Dr. De Vetter more about this project. Cool. Hopefully, I think we'll be doing that next week. But with that, let's take a quick break. I have these questions I ask all my guests. I've never had a Belgian on the show, so I'm curious how it's going to turn out.
Interesting.
Okay, we're back. So, first question, do you have a book recommendation for our listeners?
Yeah, I think in general, I would recommend all of Dave Goulson, his books. He is a professor from the UK who specializes in bumblebee biology, bumblebee ecology, also pollination, and also, of course, the diversity of bees in general. And the last couple of years, he has written, I think now, 6 popular books, which compile and present a lot of scientific information on the ecology and the fascinating world of insects and pollinators, and what the main problems are that they are facing, and what the solutions are. And he compiles a lot of information. It's really, really well written, really understandable. It's a joy to read.
It's got a good narrative flair. Like, these are books with a lot of information, but they're also written so that you could sit down and with a nice drink in your armchair and read it.
Really enjoy it. It's
great recommendation. Thank you so much, Dave Goulson's oeuvre. Read everything by Dave Goulson. Okay, that's a great recommendation. So the next question I have for you is, do you have a go-to tool? And I imagine you sound like I was going to say Swiss Army knife, but maybe the Belgium Army knife of pollination ecologists. You have a wide range of questions, and from very practical to landscape. But is there a tool in doing all that you find indispensable?
I think the solitary bee nests, actually, because they can be used for very fundamental questions about bee ecology and landscape ecology, and how that landscape and farmer practices influence bee health and bee abundance and diversity. But they can, like we spoke about the mason bees and how to rear them and efficiently control parasites, they can also be used for very applied questions. So it's a very good tool. Yeah, because you can also use them in not just in orchards, but in every agricultural setting, but also in any natural setting. And I've used them a lot, and I've benefited from that a lot, like gaining knowledge about those parasites and about landscape. And
it's so useful because I think a lot of times when we're doing native bee studies, especially in commercial crops, we look at abundance. So we don't know anything about whether they did well or whether they were heavily parasitic. We don't know their reproductive output. And I guess by having these in studies, we have a colleague of ours who uses them to assess the impacts of forest burns. on Pollinator. He can actually measure recruitment over time. It's a powerful being able to do that kind of work.
Yeah, is it the study of Galbraith?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's on my list to read.
Well, you just need to listen to the podcast.
That's good.
But you should read the papers too. They've done a lot of work there at the forest ecology lab. It's a really remarkable piece of work. But I've seen other people use these solitary bees as measures of things in the way that you have. And but I guess the trick of it is, sometimes when you're using a methodology like this, you have to learn it. And I guess learning mason bee culture is such a key part of being able to use this tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's step by step you go and you learn, and it's not that difficult. You just need to have a person that is really handy and makes them for you. Because they need to be constructed very well. So that's an important aspect.
No, I think that's true. And I think for a lot of people who've done research here, reaching out to the mason bee community for tips and tricks and how to get things up and running have been key. This begs the last question. I don't know if do you have a pollinating species that you really adore more than above all?
Well, I thought about this a lot, and I am changing the question and to favorite crop, because I'm actually not a bee specialist. I more or less I use it to infer how to optimize yield, and I think sweet cherry obviously is my favorite crop to work in, because it provides an abundance of and a diversity of bees and other insects with resources. So every year that I've sampled on sweet cherry, I found new bees and new hoverflies and new other things that every year is a new adventure.
I love that answer, because it strikes me that one way to learn, a melitology is to just pollinators in general, is to kind of learn them. But when you have a focal plant, a plant that you watch every year and you watch the patterns, I think you get a little bit of life history out of it at the same time. It's not just a stamp.
And the cool thing is sweet cherry also has these extra floral nectaries on the leaves.
Oh, yeah, right.
So you can go after the crop has flowered 4 weeks after that, you can go again and see what species visit those extra floral nectaries. The diversity is a lot less, but they, like the corbicular, the social bees, they collect this reddish exudate or I don't know how it's called.
I don't know. Yeah, it wouldn't be nectar. It's sweet, but.
Yeah, they collect it also in their corbicula.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll be darned. Yeah. We've seen it in sweet cherry in the dowels. We see it for maybe a week after the petal drop. They're active, and then it seems to. But I've never seen them collect it in their corbicula. Yeah. I'm gonna.
I've inspected it a lot. Yeah.
Fantastic. So. Well, listeners, in your cherries, you've now been challenged by Dr. Eeraerts. So see if you can see this reddish material being collected in the corbicula of the honeybees, and enjoy your cherries, because it's a great crop to see bees on.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks so much for taking time, and good luck with all your blueberry research. We look forward to hearing back in the future how that goes.
Yeah, likewise. Very much. Very big thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn, Sin, and Neil, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.